You stand in the great temple as morning light floods through open courtyards. The air shimmers with heat and incense. Around you, courtiers bow low as a figure approaches tall, angular, moving with the certainty of absolute power. But as he draws closer, something feels wrong. His face is too long, almost alien in its proportions. His body curves in ways that defy nature, neither fully masculine nor feminine. And beside him walks a young woman wearing the double crown of Egypt, the regalia of queenship hanging heavy on shoulders that seem too small, too young. You recognize her face from somewhere. Then it hits you she has his eyes, his cheekbones, the same distinctive profile carved on every temple wall. This isn't his wife, this is his daughter. And the way he touches her hand, the way she stands at his side receiving the homage of an empire, tells you this is no ceremonial accident. This is something that will echo through 3,000 years of silence, buried beneath sand and shame, until archaeologists with trembling hands finally uncover the truth. I'd be fascinated to know what part of the world you're watching from. It amazes me how a story buried for millennia in Egyptian sand can spark curiosity across every continent today. The year is 1350 BC. The place is Akhenaten, a city that exists nowhere on ancient maps because within a generation it will be erased so thoroughly that even its memory becomes dangerous. The man is Akhenaten, Pharaoh of Egypt, commander of the richest empire on earth, ruler of territories stretching from Nubia to Syria. The woman beside him is Meritaten, whose name means beloved of the Aten, and who holds titles that should never appear together. King's daughter, king's great wife, mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. Court officials who witness this have learned to keep their faces carefully neutral. Foreign ambassadors write coded dispatches home, describing what they've seen in language vague enough to avoid scandal, but specific enough to convey shock. The priests who once served Amun-Ra in Thebes, now exiled or executed, would call this the inevitable conclusion of a heresy that began with one god and ended by destroying every law that held Egyptian society together for millennia. But Akhenaten isn't a madman operating in isolation. He's the culmination of something that began long before him, a royal bloodline that had been quietly, methodically marrying itself into genetic catastrophe. His own parents were likely siblings. His grandparents were cousins. Go back far enough through the twisted branches of his family tree, and you find the same names appearing over and over in different positions, like a mathematical equation solving for its own destruction. What makes Akhenaten's story particularly haunting isn't just that he married his daughters. It's that he did so in the name of something he believed was pure, something holy, something that would save the world. It began with light. In his 4th year as pharaoh, the young king who had been born Amenhotep IV stood in the traditional temples of Thebes and experienced something that would change everything. Whether it was divine vision or the first symptoms of the genetic disorders that twisted his body, no one can say. But he emerged from that experience convinced that everything Egypt had believed for 3,000 years was a lie. The priests of Amun controlled 1/3 of Egypt's wealth. Their temples employed tens of thousands. Their political power rivaled the pharaoh's own. When Akhenaten began building temples to the Aten in Thebes itself, in the shadow of Amun's greatest sanctuary, those priests knew their world was ending. Within 2 years, Akhenaten made his most radical decision. He would abandon Thebes entirely. Somewhere in the desert between Egypt's traditional capitals, he would build a completely new city, a place untainted by association with the false gods. He called it Akhetaten Horizon of the Aten. Modern excavations know it as Amarna. The site he chose was virgin territory, backed by limestone cliffs that formed a natural amphitheater. Each morning, the sun appeared to emerge directly from these cliffs, creating a daily miracle that seemed to confirm his theology. Construction began with frantic intensity. Using revolutionary small-block construction techniques, his architects raised temples, palaces, and residential quarters with astonishing speed. Within 3 years, the basic infrastructure was complete. Within 5, an entire court had relocated to the desert. The great Temple of the Aten dominated the city's heart, but it was unlike any religious structure Egypt had ever seen. No dark inner sanctuaries, no hidden chambers where priests performed secret rituals. The entire temple was open to the sky, hundreds of offering tables arranged in courtyards where sunlight touched every surface. The god was the sun itself, visible to all, requiring no interpretation. The art that decorated this new capital was equally revolutionary. For 3 millennia, Egyptian art had followed rigid conventions designed to capture eternal truth rather than temporary appearance. Pharaohs were always shown young, perfect, posed to emphasize divine authority. Now, suddenly, images showed genuine human emotion. The royal family was depicted in intimate domestic scenes eating together, playing with children, embracing with what appeared to be genuine affection. Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, appeared in these reliefs not as a distant figure of majesty but as a real woman, beautiful and present. Their daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpaten, and eventually 3 more were shown as actual children, reaching toward their parents, playing beneath the benevolent rays of the Aten. These images seemed charming at first. A royal family that actually loved each other, ruling in harmony under their god's light. Foreign diplomats commented on the unusual intimacy of the Egyptian court, so different from the formal distance maintained by most ancient rulers. But as Akhenaten's reign progressed, those intimate family scenes began to shift in ways that made even hardened courtiers uncomfortable. Nefertiti had given Akhenaten 6 daughters but no son. In the rigid world of pharaonic Egypt, this presented a crisis. The succession required male heirs, or at least women married to men who could claim the throne through their wives. But Akhenaten's religious revolution had alienated most of the traditional royal family. Cadet branches whose loyalty to Amun remained strong were automatically excluded from succession, and foreign princes were unacceptable as consorts for daughters who needed to preserve the purity of the Aten blessed bloodline. Around the 12th year of his reign, something changed. Nefertiti disappeared from the historical record. Whether through death, disgrace, or transformation into a co-ruler under a different name, remains one of Egyptology's great mysteries. What's certain is that in the reliefs dating from this period onward, a different woman appears in the position traditionally reserved for the chief queen. Meritaten, the eldest daughter, perhaps 16 years old, now stands beside her father during religious ceremonies. She wears the double crown. She receives diplomatic gifts. Her titles multiply: king's daughter, king's great wife, mistress of the 2 lands, lady of Upper and Lower Egypt. The theological justification was complex but internally consistent within Akhenaten's revolutionary framework. The Aten was described as both father and mother of creation, containing within itself all generative power. The royal family, as earthly representatives of divine creative force, needed to mirror this cosmic unity. By marrying his daughter, Akhenaten was creating an earthly reflection of divine self-sufficiency, demonstrating that the royal house contained within itself all power necessary for continued rule. Contemporary documents provide no insight into Meritaten's feelings about this transformation from daughter to wife. The intimate domestic scenes that had characterized earlier Amarna art now take on deeply unsettling qualities. Reliefs show Akhenaten embracing Meritaten with the same gestures previously used to depict his relationship with Nefertiti. They sit together at formal banquets. They appear side by side in the royal chariot, touring the city while subjects prostrate themselves before this father-daughter, husband-wife union. For 3 years, Meritaten held the position of chief queen. Diplomatic correspondence from this period, the famous Amarna letters, includes references to the king's daughter, the queen, indicating that foreign powers recognized her elevated status, however disturbing they might have found it. Whether she bore children during this period remains unclear, but tomb reliefs suggest pregnancy or childbirth among the royal women during these years. Then, around the 15th year of Akhenaten's reign, the situation became even more complex. A mysterious figure named Shmenkhkare appears in the records, possibly Akhenaten's brother or adopted heir, elevated to co-regent. This man married Meritaten, creating an unprecedented situation where she was simultaneously the wife of two pharaohs, her father Akhenaten and his co-regent. But Akhenaten wasn't finished rearranging his family. With Meritaten now married to his co-regent, he elevated his next eldest daughter to the position of chief queen. Ankhesenpaten, whose name meant "she lives for the Aten," could not have been more than 13 or 14 years old when she found herself wearing the regalia of queenship, standing beside her father in ceremonies that had previously featured her sister. The psychological complexity of this situation defies imagination. Ankhesenpaten had watched her elder sister transform from sibling to stepmother. She'd grown up in a palace where art celebrated family intimacy, while family relationships twisted into configurations that had no names. Now she faced the same transformation, expected to become both daughter and wife to the man who had fathered her. The reliefs showing Ankhesenpaten beside her father-husband are among the most disturbing artifacts from Amarna. They depict a prepubescent girl in the full regalia of queenship, standing beneath the rays of the Aten in poses that mimic adult royal marriage. Art that had once celebrated family love now documented something that made even the revolutionary citizens of Akhenaten whisper in corners. These weren't merely ceremonial arrangements. In the royal tomb at Amarna, scenes depict what appears to be the death of Mekhetaten, another daughter, lying on a birthing bed surrounded by midwives and mourning family members. A wet nurse holds a newborn infant near the deathbed. The implication was inescapable. Mekhetaten had died in childbirth, and given the period's marriage patterns, the child was likely her father's. Meanwhile, the world beyond Akhenaten's walls was collapsing. The Amarna letters reveal a cascade of diplomatic disasters. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine wrote desperate pleas for military support against invading forces. "To the king, my lord, my god, my son," wrote Ribhada of Byblos. "If this year there are no archers, then all the lands of the king, my lord, will perish." Similar pleas flooded in from across the empire. But Akhenaten, consumed with perfecting his religious vision and managing his increasingly complex family arrangements, sent vague promises of future support that never materialized. Egypt's great military machine, built by his father Amenhotep III, rusted from neglect. Territories that had been Egyptian for centuries fell to enemies who recognized that the pharaoh's attention was focused inward, on theological abstractions rather than practical governance. The empire upon which the sun never set was beginning to shrink, and its ruler seemed not to notice. Inside Akhenaten, the city that had been built with such revolutionary energy began showing signs of strain. Archaeological evidence from the city's later levels suggests increasing poverty in residential districts even as the royal palaces remained magnificent. The population, which may have peaked at 50,000, started drifting away as opportunities diminished and the political situation grew uncertain. The artistic revolution that had seemed so liberating began to calcify into something disturbing. Statues of Akhenaten from his later years show him with an impossibly elongated skull, pendulous breasts, wide hips that obliterate any trace of masculine authority. Whether these represented actual physical characteristics, possibly symptoms of genetic disorders caused by generations of inbreeding, or symbolic representations of his theology's androgynous nature, they created an image of kingship that was deeply unsettling. Around his 17th year as pharaoh, Akhenaten died. The circumstances remain mysterious. No record of violence. No indication of plague. He may have simply worn himself out in his relentless pursuit of religious perfection, or the genetic disorders visible in his unusual physique may have finally overwhelmed him. His immediate successor was likely Nefer-Nefer-Uaten, possibly Nefertiti, ruling under a new name, or one of his daughter queens assuming power. This shadowy pharaoh lasted perhaps 2 years before disappearing from history. Then came the child who would become the most famous pharaoh of all. Tutankhaten was probably 8 or 9 years old when he took the throne, and his parentage reflected the genetic nightmare of Akhenaten's marriage policies. Modern DNA analysis confirms his parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of his sister wives. This boy, barely old enough to understand the forces swirling around him, became the instrument through which Egypt would abandon the Amarna experiment and return to traditional religion. Within 3 years, guided by powerful advisors who had survived the Amarna period, the boy king changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, honoring Amun, the god his predecessor had tried to destroy. The court abandoned Akhetaten and returned to traditional capitals. The temples of the Aten were closed, their priests dismissed, their treasuries transferred to the restored temples of the old gods. His wife was Ankhesenpaten, the same girl who had been Akhenaten's youngest daughter queen. She too changed her name to Ankhesenamun, erasing the Aten from her identity. This remarkable woman had experienced the full complexity of Amarna family arrangements, daughter, wife, and stepmother to various members of the royal house before finally becoming queen to a boy who may have been her half-brother, nephew, or son. When Tutankhamun died at 19, possibly from complications related to inbreeding-caused genetic disorders, and after the brief reign of General Horemheb seized the throne and launched a campaign of historical erasure unprecedented in its thoroughness. Every mention of Akhenaten's name was chiseled from temple walls. Every statue bearing his likeness was smashed to fragments. The revolutionary capital of Akhetaten was systematically dismantled, its stone blocks carted away to be used in other construction projects, erasing even the physical reality of the Amarna period. Official king lists compiled in later dynasties simply skipped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the 18 years between had never existed. The pharaoh, who had dared to marry his daughters in service to his god, who had proclaimed one truth against 3,000 years of tradition, was condemned to the worst fate imaginable in Egyptian belief to be forgotten, to have his name obliterated, to die a second death in the realm of memory. For more than 3 millennia, this erasure was almost completely successful. When Egyptologists first began excavating the ruins of Amarna in the late 19th century, they found a ghost city whose very existence had been hidden from history. The intimate reliefs showing Akhenaten with his daughter wives had been deliberately defaced, faces hacked away, names excised, even the cartouches containing royal titles carefully chiseled out of existence. Modern DNA analysis of royal mummies confirmed what those ancient hammers tried to destroy: the incestuous relationships within the family, the genetic damage visible in Tutankhamun's twisted spine and club foot, the biological cost of theological ambition. The human remains told a story that the defaced monuments could not fully silence. Today, standing in museums before the surviving artifacts of Amarna, we can still see traces of what that revolutionary art tried to capture. The elongated faces, the intimate embraces, the daughters whose titles proclaimed them simultaneously children and wives. Behind the beauty of the carved limestone, behind the poetic hymns to the Aten's life-giving rays, lies a family that destroyed itself in pursuit of purity, a king who sacrificed his daughters to his vision of truth, and an empire that came within years of complete collapse because one man believed he alone could see the light. The last image we have of Akhenaten shows him standing in sunlight, arms raised in worship, his body twisted into that distinctive elongated shape that was either genetic catastrophe or artistic revolution, or perhaps both simultaneously. Beside him stands one of his daughter queens, we can't tell which, because the names have been carefully erased. Her pose mirrors his. Her face turns toward the same light. And in her posture, you can see something that 3,000 years of silence couldn't quite destroy: the terrible weight of being both daughter and wife to a man who believed his love was divine mandate, who transformed family into theology, who married his children to preserve a light that died with him in the desert, leaving only shadows carved in stone and questions that echo still through empty temples where the sun once promised everything.